Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today we're tackling a pretty weighty topic, something that's kind of lurking beneath the surface of so many things we take for granted. We're talking about the human cost of industrial chemicals.
Yeah, and it's in our tires, it's in our clothes, it's even in those smartphones we're all glued to.
It's everywhere, right? And our guide for this deep dive is Jim Morris's book, The Cancer Factory.
Right, great book.
It takes us to Niagara Falls, a place we usually picture as this, natural wonder.
Right.
But the book uncovers a much darker side to its history.
Yeah, and what's fascinating is how Niagara Falls embodies this, I guess you could say, clash between America's industrial ambitions and the often ignored consequences, right?
Yeah.
See, in the early 20th century, it wasn't just the power of the falls that attracted companies like DuPont, Goodyear, all those big names.
Yeah.
It was the lure of cheap hydroelectricity.
Oh, I see. So it's readily available power, perfect for, powering factories, right?
Yeah, exactly. So factories they popped up left and right, churning out product after product.
But as we'll see, not just products, a lot of toxic byproducts as well.
Exactly, yeah.
It's almost poetic in a, tragic way, I guess. This idea of this force of nature, right, giving rise to both progress and poison.
Yeah.
And the Cancer Factory, it really digs into that, weaving together these personal stories and the larger history of workplace safety.
Right.
And I think one story that really stuck with me was Ray Klein's story.
Yeah, Ray Klein's story, it's a powerful illustration of a concept we need to grasp right off the bat: latency. Because you see, with many of these diseases caused by exposure to industrial chemicals, they don't show up for decades.
They hide out, basically.
Yeah, like take mesothelioma,
Right.
a cancer directly linked to asbestos. We're still seeing thousands of deaths from it every single year, even though we've really cracked down on asbestos use.
It's like a ticking time bomb from the past.
Exactly, the ghost of exposures past. It's really tragic.
So, when we talk about Ray Klein's story, where does it begin?
Well, he arrived in Niagara Falls in the early 60s.
Okay.
Young guy looking for, a steady job, ends up at Goodyear in their rubber chemicals division.
Okay.
Department 245, to be exact.
Yeah.
And that's where he's handling vinyl chloride. And get this, with little to no protection.
Wait, vinyl chloride? As in, seriously dangerous vinyl chloride?
Yeah, the really bad stuff. It's, for those who might not remember their high school chemistry, it's a potent carcinogen, really tough on the liver.
Okay.
And back then, most workers like Klein, they had no clue about the risks.
Wow. It's mind-boggling to think about working with something so dangerous, so casual, right? It was no big deal.
Yeah, and for the Kleins, it wasn't just Ray who suffered. They had 3 children.
Right.
And while their first son's death, it wasn't directly linked to chemical exposure, their other 2 children, John and Donna, they were born with, severe birth defects.
Yeah, and that's the part of the book that it breaks your heart.
Yeah.
John with anencephaly, which, for our listeners, it's a condition where the brain doesn't fully form.
Right.
And then Donna, born with hydrocephalus and spina bifida. The suffering this family endured, it's unimaginable.
It's really tough to read about, for sure. And the book quotes Dottie, Ray's wife, asking this really poignant question. She asks, "Do you know what it's like to carry a baby for 9 months and have it die at 6 weeks old?"
That's just, wow, yeah. It's a question that just stays with you.
It does.
Because, the book doesn't explicitly blame Ray's exposure for those specific birth defects, right? But it does highlight the research that links vinyl chloride to birth defects in general. So you're left with this really unsettling possibility.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was those kinds of possibilities that really fueled the movement for, worker safety back in the 60s.
Oh, so this wasn't just a Niagara Falls thing.
No, not at all. Across the country, workers were starting to connect the dots between their health and what they were exposed to on the job. Unions, particularly the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union, the OCAW, they were really starting to mobilize.
And wasn't that around the time that Ralph Nader was making waves with consumer safety?
Yeah.
Did that play into this at all?
It's all connected. Nader's activism, it created this wave of awareness, right?
Right.
And he actually helped connect a young activist named Steve Wodka with Tony Mazzocchi.
Okay.
And Mazzocchi was a real powerhouse within the OCAW, and he was pushing hard for a federal law to protect workers.
Okay. So are we talking about the lead up to OSHA here, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration?
Bingo. The Occupational Safety and Health Act, it finally passed in 1970.
Okay.
A huge victory for workers, but, and this is key, it wasn't the end of the fight.
Yeah.
Not even close.
Because, well, I mean, passing a law is one thing, but enforcing it, that's a whole different ballgame, especially when you've got powerful industries fighting you every step of the way.
Exactly. And that's where Dr. Eula Bingham comes in, a true trailblazer in occupational health, appointed to lead OSHA under President Carter.
Got it.
She was laser focused on carcinogens, those sneaky cancer causers.
Right.
And she made it her mission to give OSHA some teeth, to really enforce those regulations.
So she was going head to head with some of the biggest industries out there.
Oh, she faced intense opposition. Industry groups, they downplayed the risks. They threw up legal roadblocks. There were even, smear campaigns to discredit her.
Wow.
But Bingham, she stood her ground. She always put the health of workers first.
It's kind of disheartening that this whole battle between profits and worker safety, it's like a broken record throughout history.
It's a recurring nightmare, really.
Yeah.
And speaking of recurring nightmares, the story of orthotoluidine, that's a prime example.
Yeah, so orthotoluidine, it's a chemical, and it's used to make this rubber antioxidant. They call it Wingstay 100, or sometimes Nalax. And it's a big part of why this whole pattern of, corporations not doing the right thing, it's so frustrating. Okay, I gotta be honest, orthotoluidine, it doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, but I'm getting the sense that this is where things get really personal, especially for Ray Klein, right?
Yeah, it does. So remember how Ray, he worked in Department 245 at Goodyear?
Right.
That's where they were using this orthotoluidine day after day, and often with very little protection. And here's the really scary part. This chemical, it can actually be absorbed right through the skin.
Wait, so even if they were wearing gloves, coveralls, I mean, that was pretty standard gear even back then, right?
Yeah, you'd think so, but it didn't matter. They were still at risk.
Wow.
Harry Weist, who, well, we'll talk about him more later, but he worked with orthotoluidine for years, actually ended up marrying Ray Klein's daughter later on.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, small world. But anyway, he describes this really strong smell, how their lips would tingle, their clothes would be stained, all signs of exposure, and all of that, it was just considered part of the job.
It's horrifying. So you have this chemical likely causing harm even at low levels. Workers are exposed without really understanding the danger. And the whole time, this delayed effect, that latency we talked about, it's ticking away in the background.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah.
A recipe for disaster. And it wasn't just happening at Goodyear. Remember the Love Canal disaster?
Oh, right, yeah. Wasn't that in Niagara Falls, too? Something about a neighborhood built on a toxic waste dump?
That's the one.
Yeah.
And while it was a separate incident, it really amplified the fear.
Yeah, I bet.
This feeling that there were, unseen dangers lurking everywhere. If a whole neighborhood could be contaminated, what about the factory where they were working with these chemicals every single day?
It's a question that must, haunted them, and I'm guessing, based on, the book's title, that those questions, they eventually got some pretty terrifying answers, right?
They did. By the 1980s, reports of bladder cancer cases, they started popping up among Goodyear workers in Niagara Falls. And not just a few cases, we're talking a potential cluster.
Okay, so for those of us who aren't, epidemiologists, what does cancer cluster actually mean? Why is it significant?
Sure. It's a term used when there's a higher than expected number of cancer cases in a specific group of people or in a particular area.
Got it.
And in this case, it was bladder cancer. And the common thread, it seemed to be working at Goodyear's Niagara Falls plant.
So this is where Steve Wodka comes in, right? The activist who had worked with Tony Mazzocchi.
Exactly. By then, Wodka was a lawyer specializing in occupational health cases.
Okay.
And he became really central to investigating these bladder cancer cases. He worked closely with researchers from NIOSH, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health.
Got it. And so NIOSH, they launched an investigation at Goodyear.
They did. A full-blown investigation.
Yeah.
And what they found was, it was shocking. Their study confirmed that there was a significantly elevated rate of bladder cancer among these Goodyear workers, especially those who had worked in Department 245. Remember, that's where Ray Klein and Harry Weist had handled orthotoluidine.
Oh, wow. So the link between this chemical and cancer, it was finally established. What did Goodyear do?
You'd think this would be a turning point, right?
Right.
But sadly, even with this clear evidence, Goodyear and DuPont, the supplier of orthotoluidine, they both downplayed the connection.
Are you serious?
Yeah, classic corporate playbook.
Right. Profits over people.
It's infuriating. Deny, deflect, delay. That seems to be the motto.
Sadly, it often is. And this is where we run into the limitations of regulations. We have the Toxic Substances Control Act, TSCA, passed back in '76 to try and deal with chemical hazards.
Okay.
But it had a major flaw.
What was that?
It didn't require rigorous testing of chemicals before they hit the market.
Oh, wow. So you have all these chemicals, orthotoluidine being one of them, already in use with hardly any information about their long-term health effects.
Exactly.
So workers are basically, what, guinea pigs in this giant experiment. It's a pretty accurate way to put it, unfortunately.
It's mind-blowing. And what's worse, OSHA, how they assess risk, well, from what I understand, it often seems like they're regulating to the lowest common denominator.
Yeah, that's a good way to describe it. They set standards based on what they think protects the, quote, average worker.
But what about workers who are more vulnerable, maybe because of their genetics or other health issues?
Exactly. It's like saying, well, sure, this chemical might be dangerous for some people, but hey, it's fine for most. So let's just keep on trucking.
It's just wrong on so many levels. And we've been focusing on, orthotoluidine, but this is clearly a much bigger issue, right? I mean, this lack of protection for workers, it spans across so many industries.
Absolutely. This is a systemic problem.
Yeah.
The book, it highlights other really troubling examples. You got semiconductor workers, many of them women of childbearing age, and they're exposed to chemicals that might be linked to birth defects. Then you've got construction workers battling silicosis, which is a really nasty lung disease caused by silica dust.
It feels like everywhere you look, there's some new danger. So what can we do? It feels so overwhelming. Like one of those, what are those games called? Whack-a-mole?
Yeah, they can definitely feel that way.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean we're powerless, right?
Right.
One crucial step is simply awareness. Knowing about these hidden dangers, being able to, to ask the right questions, that's where it all starts.
Yeah, no, it's easy to get caught up in the anger and the despair of these stories, for sure. But I keep coming back to that idea you raised, knowledge is power.
Right.
Like if we can just educate ourselves about these risks, maybe we can protect ourselves, protect future generations.
Absolutely. And that's really the heart of Jim Morse's message in The Cancer Factory, right?
Yeah.
He doesn't want to just leave us, overwhelmed by the problem. He wants us to act. And while stronger regulations are definitely needed, he really emphasizes, the power we have as individuals to actually make a difference.
Okay, so let's talk about that. Like what can we actually do? I mean, it's easy to feel like, anything we do on a personal level it's just a drop in the bucket.
Sure. And yeah, I mean, systemic change, it's essential.
Yeah.
But our individual choices as consumers, as citizens, they do matter. They add up.
Okay.
One thing that he highlights is how many everyday products, they still contain chemicals that are linked to serious health problems.
Like what? Give me some examples. What are we all like unknowingly exposing ourselves to?
Oh, you'd be surprised. It's a lot of stuff. Methylene chloride, for one. It's a suspected carcinogen, and it's in a lot of paint strippers.
Oh.
And then there's trichloroethylene, TCE. It's used as a solvent. It's in degreasers, even in some household cleaners.
So are you saying we need to become, I don't know, obsessive label readers? Avoid anything with a chemical name we can't pronounce?
No, it's not about, becoming paranoid or going completely off the grid, right? It's about being informed.
Okay.
Read the labels. Look for safer alternatives whenever you can. And when you do use products with these chemicals, just, take precautions. Ventilation, gloves, that sort of thing. Common sense stuff.
It does seem like common sense, but I'll admit I rarely think twice about using this stuff. It's easy to forget about the risks when they're not, right there in your face.
Yeah, and that's kind of the scary thing about these chemicals, right? It's the delayed effects, the way they can, quietly build up in our bodies and the environment. But ignorance, it's not bliss. It lets these problems continue. We got to be more aware, both for ourselves and for the people who are, most at risk on the job every day.
You're right. We can't just throw our hands up and say, well, it's too big a problem. So what about the government? I mean, shouldn't they be the ones ensuring worker safety? Isn't that their job?
It is. And we have seen some progress. I mean, you mentioned the updated silica standard earlier.
Right.
But OSHA, they're often outmatched by, industry lobbying and legal loopholes.
Right.
There's this constant push to prioritize economic growth over the health of the workers, and it's a deadly equation.
It's true. It's infuriating to think how many lives could have been saved if there were just stricter regulations from the get-go, all those workers who were basically, sacrificed for profit.
It's a sobering thought, and it shows why we can't rely on the government alone to fix this. We need a multi-pronged approach.
Okay.
Individual action, corporate responsibility, and yes, holding our elected officials accountable for creating a system that actually protects workers.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a lot to process, but it's also, I think, a powerful call to action. And Jim Morris, I mean, in The Cancer Factory, he really lays bare this hidden crisis.
Yeah.
But he also reminds us that we have a voice, that we have choices, and that we can make a difference.
That's right. And that's what makes this book so important. It's not just a history lesson, right? It's like a roadmap for how to create change.
Right.
And the first step on that journey, it's simply opening our eyes to the problem.
Yeah. To paraphrase a popular quote, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing.
Right.
So let's not do nothing, right? Let's stay informed, let's ask those tough questions, and let's demand better for ourselves, for workers, and for the generations that come after us.
Well said. I think that's a perfect place to wrap up this deep dive
Yeah.
into the hidden costs of industrial chemicals.
Yeah.
We hope you found it, well, informative, thought-provoking, and maybe even a little inspiring, because ultimately the fight for a safer, more just world, it starts with each of us.